Ever think about like what comes after, after all this life stuff? I mean, different religions and beliefs have some pretty crazy ideas about it.
Yeah.
But today we're taking a deep dive into one specific take on Judgment Day,
Hmm.
all based on the book of Revelation, chapter 20.
Yeah, Revelation chapter 20. Oh man, it's a chapter that's just packed with intense imagery and symbolism.
Oh
And
yeah.
what's really interesting about the outline we're looking at is the way it zooms in on this idea of the last judgment.
Okay.
It adds like a whole other layer of complexity to how people usually think about Judgment Day.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Right.
What exactly is this last judgment
Oh yeah.
according to Revelation?
So imagine this, right?
Yeah.
God sitting on this massive great white throne
Ah,
with every single person who's ever lived standing before him.
okay.
That's the last judgment as it's described in Revelation 20:1-15. It's
Intense.
like this ultimate separation,
Yeah.
the righteous from the ungodly.
Yeah.
And there are eternal consequences for both.
Okay.
And here's something that might surprise you. It doesn't happen right away.
What?
This last judgment thing, it takes place after the millennium.
Hold on. So you're saying it's not like game over as soon as you die?
Nope, not instant at all.
There's this whole millennium thing first. Yeah.
Exactly. This interpretation puts the last judgment way down the line.
Okay. All right. So walk me through this.
Sure.
What happens before this last judgment?
Okay, so picture this. The millennium's been going on for 1,000 years, right?
Mhm.
Christ is reigning, and then boom, Satan makes a grand re-entrance.
What, Satan gets a sequel?
Yeah, kinda. He's been bound for 1,000 years, but Revelation 20:7-8 tells us he's let loose for one last hurrah.
You'd think after 1,000 years he'd be ready to just chill.
Uh-huh. Right?
So what does he do?
Well, he stirs up one final rebellion against God,
Oh, boy.
rallies his forces for this ultimate showdown, but don't worry. In the end, Revelation 20:9-10 tells us he gets tossed into the lake of fire,
Okay.
which is basically eternal separation from God.
So Satan's story ends there.
Right.
But what about everyone else?
Yeah.
Is that when everyone faces the last judgment?
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. According to this outline, Christians, those who believe in Christ,
Yeah.
they're not judged at the last judgment.
They get a free pass.
Yeah.
Seriously.
It's a key point in this interpretation.
Yeah, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, they base it on verses like John 5:24, where Jesus says that believers have passed from death to life. So they're not subject to that same judgment as those who haven't accepted Christ.
So if Christians aren't being judged, then who is?
The last judgment is for those who haven't accepted Christ.
Okay.
It's their deeds that are being weighed.
Right.
And the consequence is eternal separation from God.
Whoa. Okay.
thing.
Now the source mentions this judgment seat of Christ.
Yeah.
Are we talking about two different judgments here?
Exactly. You've got the last judgment, which is about condemnation for the ungodly.
Right.
And then you have the judgment seat of Christ described in 2 Corinthians 5:10. That one's specifically for believers. It's not about punishment,
Yeah.
but about assessing their actions and rewarding them based on how they lived out their faith.
So it's less about avoiding judgment altogether and more about facing a different kind of judgment.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. One focused on rewards, not condemnation. And that distinction is really crucial for understanding this whole interpretation of Judgment Day. You see, it all goes back to the idea that, in this view, salvation isn't something you earn through your actions.
Right.
It's something you receive through faith in Christ.
Makes sense. Now, what about this book of life thing?
Ah, the book of life.
Yeah, the source keeps mentioning it, especially in relation to the last judgment.
It's one of those really powerful symbols in Revelation.
So what does it actually represent?
Think of it like a divine record book,
Okay.
where God has written the names of every single person who is saved. Then during the last judgment,
Right.
Revelation 20:1-13 says this book is opened. And if your name isn't in there, well, you face the consequences.
And we're talking thrown into the lake of fire here.
Yeah, it's not a pretty picture.
Definitely raises the stakes. But how does someone even get their name in this book?
That's the big question, right?
Is it like already decided, or do our actions actually matter?
It's a question that's puzzled theologians for ages, and there are a lot of different opinions on it. But this particular interpretation, it really emphasizes one main path, accepting Christ. They point to verses like John 5:24 and Romans 10:9-10,
Okay.
suggesting that belief and confession, those are the keys getting your name in that book.
So it's not about being perfect or following all the rules perfectly.
Nope.
It's about making that decision to embrace Christ.
That's the core of it. According to this interpretation, that personal choice is what determines your eternal fate.
Wow. Okay. So let's say someone's listening to this and they're thinking, okay, this last judgment stuff is pretty intense. What if I want to make that choice to accept Christ? How do I actually do that?
It's a deeply personal journey.
Yeah.
And there's no one right way.
Right.
But based on this source, it all starts with a sincere belief in Christ,
Okay.
a willingness to confess him as Lord, and really exploring those key verses we talked about.
So no magic ritual or anything like that?
No, it's much more about an internal shift, an inward transformation,
Okay.
and then making that decision public.
All right. So once you've made that step, then.
According to this interpretation, you're set. You're exempt from the last judgment.
Wow. That's a lot to process.
It is.
This whole last judgment, the judgment seat of Christ, the book of life.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Let's take a moment to digest all this. We'll be back in a flash to continue our deep dive into Judgment Day.
Sounds good.
All right, we're back. And wow, my brain is still buzzing a little bit from all this Judgment Day talk.
Yeah, it's intense stuff.
You know, one thing I'm still kind of grappling with is this whole idea that Christians are just exempt from the last judgment.
Right.
It almost feels too good to be true,
Yeah.
you know? Like you accept Christ and boom, you're off the hook no matter what.
Yeah, I could see how that might feel a little like a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Exactly. Especially when we're talking about, you know, eternal consequences.
For sure.
So the source keeps bringing up those verses about passing from death to life and being justified by faith.
Right.
But it still feels a little fuzzy to me.
Okay.
Like, where's the accountability for people who do believe?
Well, accountability isn't completely absent in this interpretation. Remember we talked about that judgment seat of Christ.
Right.
That's specifically for believers.
Okay.
It's not about sending them to the lake of fire or anything like that.
Right.
It's more about looking at their actions and how they lived out their faith.
So like a performance review instead of a trial.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. This difference between the two judgments, it's super important for understanding this whole view of Judgment Day.
Okay.
Because it all comes back to the idea that salvation, it's not about earning points.
Right.
It's about accepting Christ's sacrifice.
So actions matter,
Yeah,
but they don't decide your final destination.
exactly. Your face does that.
So while believers are thinking about this judgment seat of Christ, the Last Judgment, it's for everybody else.
Right.
And that's where that whole mysterious book of life comes in.
Yeah, the divine guest list.
If your name's not in there, well,
Ones aren't looking too good.
it makes you think, though, how do you even get your name in that book?
It's the million-dollar question, right?
Is it destiny, or do our choices make a difference?
It's something people have debated for centuries, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But this specific interpretation, it really emphasizes that accepting Christ, that's the way to get in the book of life.
Okay.
They keep coming back to those verses we talked about, John 5.24, Romans 10.910.
Yeah, the ones about believing and confessing.
Exactly.
So it's not about following every single rule.
Not in this view.
It's about making that conscious choice to trust in Christ.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. Ultimately, that choice is what determines where you end up.
So it's a choice, not like a checklist.
Right.
You make that choice, and boom, you're in the book of life.
That's the emphasis here.
Yeah.
It's all about giving believers that sense of security.
Okay.
You don't have to constantly worry about earning your spot. You're resting in the fact that your faith has secured it for you.
So let's say someone is listening to all of this.
Right.
And they're thinking, man, this last judgment, this is serious stuff. What if I want to make that choice to accept Christ?
Yeah.
How do I do that?
Well, there's not like a specific ritual or ceremony you have to go through.
Right.
This source would probably tell you to go back to those key verses we talked about.
Okay.
It starts with a real, genuine belief in Christ,
Okay.
and then a willingness to say that out loud, to confess him as Lord.
So nothing too flashy or public.
Right. It's more about what's happening on the inside.
An internal change.
Yeah, and then expressing that change to the world.
So then what happens, according to this interpretation, you're good to go.
Exactly. You've taken that leap of faith, and that's what they're emphasizing. It's a really powerful message of hope.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you think about the other side of things, the last judgment.
Right. It makes you stop and think.
For sure. This whole deep dive into Judgment Day, it's been a lot to think about.
Yeah, it's a big topic.
But before we jump to any conclusions, I think it's time to take a step back and really ask ourselves, what does all this mean for us, for the listeners?
That's a great point.
Man, we have covered so much in this deep dive into Judgment Day.
Yeah, no, all right.
This whole interpretation from Revelation 20, those two different judgments, the last judgment, the judgment seat of Christ.
Yeah, and don't forget about that mysterious book of life.
Oh, yeah. The book of life. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And it's just amazing how much is packed into one single chapter of Revelation.
Yeah,
You know, it just shows how these ancient texts can still spark so much discussion and debate even today.
Absolutely. So before we wrap things up, let's take a minute to think about what we've learned.
Okay.
We started with this really intense picture of the Last Judgment.
Right. With everyone gathered before God.
Yeah, the righteous and the ungodly being separated. That whole scene.
It's like this cosmic courtroom drama.
Totally. And then we talked about all the stuff that happens before that final moment, you know?
Yeah, like Satan getting released after the millennium.
Right, his final rebellion, then finally getting defeated.
It's wild.
It is. And then there's that twist that we talked about.
Oh, yeah?
How Christians, they're not part of the Last Judgment at all.
According to this interpretation anyway.
Right, because they've already made that transition from death to life through their belief in Christ.
Yeah, they're not facing that condemnation. They're standing before the judgment seat of Christ.
Right, where it's about evaluating their actions, not punishing them.
And maybe even getting some rewards.
Exactly. And for the people who haven't accepted Christ, their fate is still up in the air.
Right.
With the book of life acting as this ultimate guest list for eternity.
It really makes you think.
Doesn't it? It makes you think about what salvation actually means, you know? About how powerful belief is. And about the choices we make in this life.
Yeah, for sure. So where does all of this leave you, the listener?
That's the big question. What are you taking away from all of this?
Well, I think the first thing to do is just to stop and think about your own beliefs. What do you believe happens after we die?
Yeah, does this interpretation of Revelation 20 make sense to you?
Or do you see things differently?
There's no right or wrong answer here.
It's just something to really think about.
Right. And if you are a believer, this interpretation, it offers you a lot of comfort, you know?
Yeah, you don't have to worry about that final judgment.
Because you're already saved.
Exactly.
But if you're not a believer, or if you're still figuring things out, this interpretation brings up some really important questions.
Like, what do you think about salvation?
Right. And what path are you choosing for yourself?
It's heavy stuff.
It is. But we're not trying to give you all the answers here.
Right. The point is to make you want to find those answers yourself.
Exactly. So don't just take our word for it.
Go read Revelation 20.
Yeah. Dig into those verses we talked about.
And come to your own conclusions.
Because that's where the real growth happens. When you wrestle with these ideas and you make them your own.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Judgment Day, we want to leave you with this one final thought.
Okay.
If this whole idea of a final judgment, it's supposed to make us think and make us act.
Yeah.
How does it change the choices you make today? How does it affect your relationship with your faith, with yourself, with the world around you?
That's a powerful question.
It is, and we encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep searching for answers that make sense to you.
Because that's what this whole journey of faith is all about.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore together.
See you then.
Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those minds engaged.